Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Coach's Corner. This time, for real, we'll be going over VOD reviews, all the techniques. Really excited to hear from Ramses and Tony. I think as of right now in the current meta, they do the most VOD review. Me and Bam, we're more old school VOD reviewers. I don't know. We did a lot of VOD review in like previous games and like especially
Our time is past, Chuck.
our
Just
time
keep
has
it a buck.
passed. Yeah.
Our time is past.
Not as actively coaching as the other two there on the bottom. But if you guys do enjoy the content, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Let us know what you think is the most important thing in VOD review in the comments. So I'd love to hear your guys' opinion on this topic. And of course, if you guys want to ask us direct questions, you can support us on Discord. You can subscribe for $5 a month. It's the best creator split. It's 90-10, so it helps us out a lot. And we'll go ahead and answer your questions, and that'll be on the Discord. So make sure that's the best way to support us. And yeah, we can get right into the topic. So, VOD reviewing. I think the concept of VOD reviewing, very important because especially watching your losses, you can watch yourself win and boost your ego. That's always cool and see what you did right. But the most important thing is you want to see what your opponent is exploiting to go ahead and do damage to you, take your stocks, win games, win sets, right? So for me, I always think the most important thing about VOD review is seeing where you lost your stock and the decisions that led up to that. Not the actual edge guard or ledge trap, but it's usually takes place. Like you still want to see how you're recovering or how you're acting in disadvantage. That's very important. But what neutral interaction led you to that, right? Did you give up too much stage by retreating too much and you ended up in the corner? And then from the corner situation, your opponent has a very huge advantage because they're Cloud or Fox and stuff like that, right? Do you have to stand your ground more against characters that get more off of the corner? And obviously with the more knowledge you have about the game, then you can go ahead and decipher this. So I think for us, we're going to be more focused on VOD review for beginners, I think, and then we can kind of scale it up from there, right? So kind of seeing where you lose your stock and seeing, and you will learn from this, right? You're like, man, I always seem to get back aired by Cloud in the corner or some kind of scenario where I like roll in and he up smashes my roll, right? And you're going to start to see patterns. And then you can also see if you are struggling in terms of like, man, what should I do in this situation? Or if you want to learn more about a character, you can VOD review not only your VODs, but the best players of X character, or even maybe your local PR players, like more of a local PR level of those characters, and see what they do in those situations and what makes those characters strong. So Bam, what are your thoughts on, I guess, like baseline VOD reviews, where to start for most players?
I think you hit the nail on the head already on kind of the basic, right? Patterns, identifying patterns, also breaking down certain game states, right? So I think me like personally, like, okay, what am I doing when I'm in a juggle situation? What am I doing when I'm off stage? What am I doing when I'm hanging on the ledge? Right? What am I
Could you
doing
explain
in
game
these high
states real
percentage
quick
situations?
for people that might not know what a game state is?
Yeah, for sure. So, I think the big thing here, right? Like when we're talking about game states, like we're talking about like certain aspects of the like changing the game, right? Where it's like, it's a advantage state, right? You hear people spam advantage state all the time, right? And of course, it's going to be when like, if you have your opponent in a situation that is more likely you're getting a reward from it than them, right? That's going to be your advantage. So like we're talking about simple things, people break down neutral, certain parts are neutral, right? But even if you were baseline, you want to just feel kind of neutral on the ledge, edge guard, dealing with juggling, juggling someone, etc. Right? Being able to kind of break down the game in those aspects, right? And then from there, reading what patterns are in those moments, right? Because it will happen sometimes, but not. You may have maybe you tend to lean on an aggressive option on the ledge, and maybe you tend to lean on the defensive option, right? When you juggle, right? And if you don't identify and break those things down, you may just be like, oh yeah, maybe I'm balanced. No, you're not balanced. All right. So certain things give a predictive outcome, right? Based on what you're doing. So I think that's probably the basic thing that you can do when you were looking at your bot. So yeah, I'm like we talked about earlier on, right? Obviously, Ramsey and Tony are ones who are currently coaching a lot of incredible players and stuff as well. And so I really want to hear, like Ramsey, like what do you look at when you're bringing into a student and you're trying to teach them the brilliance of VOD review? Like what do you usually start off with to really get them to see the value in it?
I think for me, the starting point of VOD review was always kind of accentuating the importance of a plan. And so I think a lot of VOD review is about comparing reality to expectations. And so if you don't have expectations, VOD review often becomes a little bit hard to structure. And so the starting point for VOD review really is like, okay, I need to have a plan, because what you go into when you go into a match, we should kind of approach it from like a scientific theory point of view, right? Which is essentially there's an observation, leads to hypotheses, and then you test the hypotheses, revisit the hypotheses based on the results until you're satisfied with the end result. And so if you never have a hypothesis, you're just kind of like going by feel. Yeah, there's things you can learn, right? And you can go like, you can look at these players that don't really have a strategy, and you can look at the individual actions, and you can definitely like find errors, like execution errors or just knowledge errors, or you reacted bad, stuff like that. But it will never really fix the core issues. I think these are all like individual interactions, but usually the most growth is found by adjusting your perspective, by thinking about the game in a way that you didn't think about the game before. And so the only way to really find that consistently is to have a plan. So for example, you can say, hey, I'm playing Shulk against Cloud, and my plan is Cloud's strongest tool is short out back air. My understanding is that characters rely on their strongest tool in neutral. And so because his strongest tool is back air, my strongest tool is like short up nair, generally I will win those interactions. And so my plan will be to rely on nair to anti-air his back airs. And then if he goes into like grounded side B and anti-airs, he's committing more, and I can start with punishing. So this is like super dumbed down, of course. But just having a plan like that allows you to then VOD review and see, hey, what actually worked and what didn't. So maybe you figure out, actually, his bear can beat my nair. Or actually, his grounded side B is way harder to whiff punish than I thought, right? And so if you look at a VOD without a plan like that in mind, and you just see someone with a side B, you might think, hey, it's a whiff side B, who cares? But if you know that part of your core strategy is to whiff punish these anti-airs by not jumping, right? Then suddenly these interactions get a whole different idea. And so the structure that I kind of try to get my students on to start off with is the idea of interaction situation strategy. And so generally we start off by thinking, okay, what are good interactions? What are good moves for my character? So for example, like Cloud back air. And then we think, okay, in what situations do we have access to these interactions? Do we have access to these moves? And so our strategy is to create these situations. And once you can start identifying the game in terms of interaction situation strategy, VOD review becomes a lot easier, because oftentimes the error is in one of these three, right? So either you got the right situation but you went for the wrong interaction, or you got the wrong situation altogether, right? Or you got the wrong strategy altogether. So these are essentially three layers that you can always tweak on. You can say, hey, I should be going for a different interaction, or hey, I should be going for a different situation, or you can say, hey, I should be going for a different strategy. And so what this allows you to do is it allows you to extract a lot of information from VOD reviews without going too deep. Now, of course, if it's like more of a top level player, it gets more complex. But I think if you're looking to start off with VOD review and you're lost in how to make it productive, what I really recommend is to VOD review a game in which you had a plan, and then think about your plan in terms of interaction, situation, strategy, and then see, did you execute on it well? Did it work out the way you thought it would work out? Where did you get checked? And so I have a video on my channel. I'm going to plug it. It's actually one of the first videos I ever posted. It's called The 5 Aspects of a Competitive Player. Which is a mouthful, and it goes over 5 elements that I think are important for any competitive player, and they're execution, knowledge, Yomi, valuation, and piloting. And so execution is just like how well do you execute, knowledge is what do you know, Yomi is essentially how good are you at reading the opponent, valuation is how well do you value your moves, right? So can you accurately identify what value is assigned to what move. This is also known as expected value in game theory. And then there's piloting. So in other words, how well do you autopilot? When does your delivered pilot kick in? How do you manage that? And so again, you don't have to get that deep, but watching that video and understanding, okay, there are like different ways in which mistakes can be made, right? It can be execution, it can be this, it can be that. I think that's also a really powerful part if you're starting off your VOD review journey. So that's my starting point. I'd like to hear what Tony thinks.
So My starting point would probably be more of a history of public knowledgeable people. Starting back at, I think the first Smash player I realized you could learn notes from was Havoc back in Brawl. Snake player.
Snake, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
Snake
my
Meta Knight
boy,
player.
man.
Yes.
Very
And-
old school.
The GOAT.
You know, it's
Yes,
crazy.
yes.
He still
was-
plays Ultimate. Like sometimes I'll see him.
He
tweeting
does.
out, like,
He does,
big clips.
yeah.
Does he play banjo?
No, I think
Or
he
Snake?
plays
No,
Snake.
that is a different Smash 4 player.
You
Tear
Bear?
Yes, Tear
You talking
Bear.
about Tear
That was
Bear,
Tear
boy,
Bear.
dude.
Yeah.
You guys are talking about the culture right now, dude. But
They're
anyways,
both
go
San
ahead, go
Diego,
ahead.
to be fair.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes,
okay.
they
So
are.
it was a fair
Similar,
enough
yeah,
mistake.
similar.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, it was. FC was.
I am European. I don't even know.
But it's all on the West Coast.
Yeah.
So- Havoc was, especially for his time, a very thoughtful player, and he was also considerate enough of the people around him to actually publish his notes, publish his reasoning and perceptions of the game, which today would just be essentially a mid-level thoughtful player sharing their thoughts. But at the time, this was a considerably rare thing. So him, one of the other great minds of the game, TKD, would also publish his thoughts or journal notes on the game. TKD being one of the most brilliant players in the history of the game, who just decided to stop going forward with it. And this was someone who was one of the best Meta Knights on the planet and decided to start playing Fox and show that the character was actually a high tier character because he just thought it would be interesting. So he started beating top players with Fox back when this is really hard to imagine now, but back then Fox was considered either a low or a mid tier character. And so he was the unplayable Spacey. And we now know, of course, in hindsight, that there is no such thing as an unplayable Spacey. But back then, again, this comes down to there's always an originator. So these players' notes inspired me a lot to actually start looking at the game. And then when it comes to VOD reviewing, I think the advice that I use to this day actually comes from New York player Anti, who is no longer in the Smash community, but he was also a very smart young man, even though he didn't always share his notes in as scholastic a manner as the aforementioned players. He specifically mentioned that he liked to go through his sets and basically pause every single time he would see somebody do something that he thought was very interesting, which I have then since essentially looked into as the game's choke points. And that is to say there are certain points in the game, or game states, as Man mentioned, where most of the character's options become fairly universal. And I've alluded to this before. It's when you're shielding, whenever a character grabs the ledge, for the most part, most of the cast is going to have the exact same inputs, even if the frame data is slightly different. And so they're going to have the ledge options, or they're going to have rolls out of shield, jump out of shield, a B out of shield, etc., etc. And so you go from having uncountable numbers of options to just having a very large number of options and permutations and mix-ups that you can have. And so it simplifies the game extremely. And so you just pause there and you make a prediction, or a hypothesis, as Ramses mentioned. So say, I expect the next thing to do, or this player to do the next thing. Like we'll say, jump out a shield, and then don't just make a prediction. Evaluate why you believe what you believe. I think they're going to jump out of shield because I've seen them jump out of shield the last 2 times, or this is a bad position to be on the ground, or have banana, or I want to grab them, or I have a down smash that will KO, and so they'll jump because there's no way they can get hit by it that way, and I think they're afraid of it. It doesn't matter. And so you see if it happened, and if what you expected didn't happen, ask yourself, why might it have been different? What are the benefits or expectations of what they would go for? And then the other major starting point that I recommend, whether you are beginning your VOD review journey, or even if you are a top player, is I think that the most interesting part of the game is Go. And by that, I mean, generally, whenever you are playing Smash Brothers or any real playstyle-based game, you're going to have a lot of player expression and nuances to whether someone is playing proactively, whether they're trying to get something started or responding to something. And as I think we've established, my personal preference is to go for proactive options that win the game. There's only one moment in the game in which every single player is playing proactively, and it is, without exception, going to be go. So the first actions that any player is going to make is fundamentally not in response to something else, because nothing else has taken place. Therefore, we can say that whatever you see from the first player is going to be toward what they view as winning the game. And so even if that is putting them into a position to respond to something, that still means that you can then shift the game from their perspective to being something that allows them, they think they win the game if they can respond from that position. And so the idea is, when you are looking at go, you want to look for extremes. You want to look at what is the fastest, what is the thing that's going to get them the most percent from this position, what is the most of a position. So the idea here is you want to think of critical thinking questions. Who, what, when, where, why, how. So from here, you who is obviously more applicable in things like doubles, or when there's multiple characters on the screen, something like Ice Climbers or Luma, Rosa, etc., where there's actually multiple targets. It's very easy to ask those kinds of questions. But even when you don't, another theory that I've referenced is Drugged Fox's theory of neutral, which is essentially the idea that there is a floating frame advantage, and that even on things that are safe on whiff, you are ultimately still minus on whiff to a degree, which means that the next neutral interaction for the player who did not whiff is going to have a few frames shaved off of their relative frame startup that the opponent cannot interrupt. And so this means that even if you know your opponent is whiffing something and going to dash attack, even if that dash attack is slightly faster than what you want to stuff it with, because they are whiffing something that puts them at frame disadvantage, you are now in position so that you can read that quote unquote safe thing that they were whiffing. And if you read the pattern for when they're going in, you can start up something that's slow but safe to go ahead and stuff that out. So this would be an example of
landing aerial.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Rob Nair is one of the most quintessential examples of this, where Rob players will tell you it's really hard to find safe times to start up my Nair, but the players who don't play Rob don't feel that way, and it's because the players who don't play Rob generally aren't paying attention to managing when they go in, or the frame advantage that they have for when they go in. And likewise, the Rob players typically aren't earning the startup of their neutral safe aerials. And so you want to look at that. You want to look at what places your opponent has a preference for. When they start the match, are they going towards center stage? Are they going for the ledge? Do they like to be on platforms? Are they inherently drifting toward your character? Because everyone has different points or places or spaces that they prefer and that they're going to gravitate toward. And so the idea here is that everyone has a sort of orbit or rubber band that they are attached to. Then they're constantly being pulled through the match. And this is, I think, easiest to observe when you watch a game in 2x speed, because you are going to see that whenever one character moves, sometimes the other character is going to move in the same direction for roughly the same amount of space. And so the idea is you can sometimes even witness one of them pulling the other character around, or alternatively, you can see no matter what happens with the action state, that somehow one of the characters always seems to land on the same spot on the same map. So that's of course a what or where. What would be more of it? What do they like to do when they touch that space? What do they like to do when they reach your character model? Like, what do they like to start with combo starters, etc., etc. And so the idea is, even though there's 1,000 things your character can be doing, the player is going to have a preference to a relative few things. So the idea is most players are going to have a simple game plan regardless of how complex their character is or can be. And then, of course, continuing on, you get the why, which is what we alluded to earlier, recognizing the purpose behind things, recognizing what's going through people's minds, what cons of their decisions are. Sometimes it doesn't have to be rational, but if you look for their perspective, sometimes you can find it. And of course, you get things like win, which is, as I believe we've alluded to before, also is Light's forte. I would consider him the best win player on the planet. Generally, if people are playing to a rhythm you can expect light to outrhythm them either by slowing down or speeding up to be just off tempo for them to exploit when they do things. And it can be a minutia, but it's something that does. And then of course you go how. Like it's one thing to say, oh well, they like to do a high aerial or a low aerial, or they like to forward air on this specific spot on the platform, but how would be more of a transition there. So do they like to forward air and drift toward you, drift away? Do they like to do it while they're moving to a place, to a person? They like to do it fast, slow, etc. So there's lots of different descriptors that you can apply to something that is just forward air, but there are many different kinds of forward airs depending on adding the other context into these things. And then of course each of these subjects can be mingled. If you mix up just how you do something or what you do, then it's going to change. And so the idea is, again, even though things can be complicated, if you are pausing at specific points and then trying to answer these questions for those points and recognizing where you're incorrect on your assumptions and then replacing your previous assumptions with new information, then what you're going to find is that you will learn a better concept of what your opponent's game plan is looking like. And you can also apply this to your own, of course. And so you can find out that maybe your habits are not what you expected them to be, because sometimes who, what, when, where, and how don't match up with your why or what you thought you were consciously doing. Sometimes they're different. And so the idea is it's also an excellent way to either prepare for yourself, prepare for your opponent, or to prepare for adjusting yourself, as everyone has mentioned so far.
Yeah. One real quick thing I wanted to add too, we were talking about Tony, and I think talked about a little before in terms of like Rob Nair, right, and how people's perspective on it, right? When you are the non-Rob player, or if you haven't played Rob, right, why you're going to always lean into the benefits and the pros and why this is, I can't do anything against this move. It's so insane. But at the same time, Rob is, there's going to be Rob mains that are going to be like, yeah, it's hard to find out where you can really place Nair, or place Nair, right? And it's one of those things where learning to identify that, how can those potentially both be true, right, to a certain extent. And it's because Robs, of course, are going to be so transfixed on the costs, right? The precursor, that they have to go through in order to do it, versus you, the player, you're just simply looking at the reward, right? And being able to understand those things and be able to see like what that movement's going to be beforehand. And, it could be for a move. It could be in getting, how this person gets into that positioning to do the thing that they're going to do. All the things, like, it's very important to understand it. And I think that's something as to why, like we were talking about earlier with kind of the choke points, that's something like a lot of those guys would do, like even at K9 and a bunch of them like that, the Sky's House, whatever it may be, like a lot of them would sit down and be like, okay, we're here, what's going to happen next, right? And a lot of it was them being able to get more proficient at understanding what is good and beneficial for that, that player, that character at that point in time, in the context of the, the game state they're in. And also understanding, being able to read the precursor, movement or actions that will happen, so that that can also help them, reaffirm their thought process on it. And those things are very, very important. If you're able to see those things in players, like, it essentially allows you to read, like, read the future per se, right? And it can help a ton with your gameplay, and also understanding yourself as to why is someone reading me like this all the time. We talk about the famous, oh, well, MK Leo Nair's here all the time and he doesn't get punished. How are they getting hit by that, right? And you might have a tell. You might be like, oh, like I dash grab here, and they always find out, well, yeah, you're also just dash dancing back and forth, and it's very clear that you're waiting for something to grab, right? Versus, Leo putting out some kind of feint or something along those lines to trigger a situation which he knows he can punish with a dash grab, right? Both may look like, oh, I just did a dash grab. But, once you actually look at the context, right? When you look at the critical, like, thought behind it, as Tony was talking about, all of a sudden, those two things that seem like they were similar, right? Or they're just the same, they're actually very, very different. And it's important to start looking at those things when you're going through your VOD review. But just to piggyback off what you were saying, Tony, because I think that's so important.
Yeah, and I think another like baseline thing I talked about earlier was like stocks, but I think another one that's really important for beginner players is seeing where you commit. A commitment is anything like a dash grab, a dash attack, smash attack. These are all very committal options, and you generally want to keep your commitment rate, is what I like to call it, how often you're committing, on the lower side, because you want justification to the commitment, right? You're putting yourself at a huge frame disadvantage, which makes it very easy to punish. But one thing is you want to see how often you commit, because generally you want that to be on the lower side if you want your game data to be consistent. Because I've coached newer players and they're like, well, I just want to play like this. And I'm like, okay, cool. You can play like that, but you are not going to have consistent gameplay because you are throwing out very laggy moves that can be punished. And you might read your opponent 5 times in a row. But if Leo ain't out here, or these other players, these other top players, they don't throw out 5 smash attacks in a row because they don't think they can hard read someone 5 times in a row. So if they're that good at the game and they don't do it, well, again, you just want to have a consistent game plan, right? You want to have consistency to your gameplay, so the rate in which you commit wants to be on the lower side, and you want to have justifications to those commitments. So another thing that when it comes to commitment rate, you want it to be on the lower side, but when and where you commit is so important. So this is something that I hate when I watch Smash, is when I watch someone run across the entire stage and then throw a dash grab. It's like, dude, you ran from one side of FD all the way to the other side, and you just ripped a dash grab from that far away. You got to think that whole time your opponent is reacting to you, right? So you really thought your opponent was still going to sit there and shield after watching you run across the entire stage, and then you dash? Like, no, that's not going to happen. Like, you got to be really bad to get hit by something like that. So
protagonist energy, dude.
Understand at when you commit and where you commit is very important, because if I'm at dash grab distance just from like a single dash into a grab, that's pretty hard to react to, right? It's depending on the character, obviously, but you want to make sure that you're reading where your opponent is going to be situated. So if I go for a dash attack as Fox and they shield it, right? Where I committed was not bad. The RPS happened. So where are you forcing RPSs, and is your opponent even there when you force the RPS? So when you go for a commitment, you're trying to force an RPS onto someone, but if they're not there, then it's not an RPS, then they whiff punish you, right? So really try to track and see if, again, me dash attack, or like a Fox dash attacking someone's shield, I just lost the RPS. But I committed and I knew where they were going to be when I committed. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. I just lost the RPS. You're not going to win every single RPS. A huge hole in your game plan is if you commit somewhere and they're not even there. That means the way you're committing or how long it takes for you to get to the spot where you're committing, it might be too long. You might have to navigate through that. But just another really important thing, just like how your stock is being taken, where you're committing to, and I'm not even trying to say to look over the RPS. Obviously, if someone is just shielding every single one of your dash attacks, maybe you should dash grab instead of dash attack. That's pretty obvious. I don't need to tell you that. But it's the more of the idea of like, when I'm forcing an RPS, is my opponent there? Because when you do go for these commitments, you want to just make sure your opponent's there. Again, you're not going to win every RPS, but that's another really big one. And I don't know if you guys had any other more baseline stuff, because I think most of this episode is going to be talking about like high to top level VOD review, which is essentially problem solving. It's especially when you get to top level. I think this is the most fun part about being a coach, is when you're VOD reviewing a matchup and you're literally trying to change the metagame. You're trying to find answers to problems that don't have answers to them. And I think personally, that's the most fun part about VOD review. Any thought, or did any of you guys have any more things to touch up on in terms of like beginner to mid-level VOD review?
I will say, relative to what the last couple points were, if you want to see how someone responded to you, instead of saying, oh, well, they always react to me doing X or Y, before you made that input, go back 20 frames in the video, roughly, and see what animation they saw to prompt that.
Mm-hmm.
And to go ahead and segue us into the next way, one of the first things you can do moving into higher level Smash is pay attention to what animations can give tells, because you can also just give those tells without following up with the subsequent interaction or action that they were reading from it. And so the idea is you can give essentially these empty tells to control your opponent's responses by then showing them that animation in the first place. But this requires you to recognize what animations the specific opponent is reacting to, because there is no simple way of feinting and baiting your opponents. You can have movement patterns or drills that have overall like a package of different things, and then hopefully something sticks, but there is no single feint that you can go for. Like you can't bait out Spargo with something that you can also bait out your local 2-2er with. Just because the local 2-2er either isn't going to recognize it at all, or Spargo isn't going to fall for it at all. You have to tune your baits to your specific opponent's sensitivities or preferences. And everybody has differences that they recognize, different animations, different times and speeds that they're going to respond to those different animations.
Yeah, no, I love that. Again, like leveraging, like, I mean, honestly, looking for those who are sports or anything like that, like you talk about feints, right? You talk about that in, in boxing or martial arts, where it may be, right? Like, what does a feint look like, right? You're trying to replicate this, like, what the precursor of a punch, right? Or something. You're not going to throw a full punch and then be like, oh man, this should have worked. Like, that's not a feint. That's a full punch that you just whiffed, right? Like that's what that is. That's the difference. So understanding that, and then again, great point. The fact that you need to look at what your opponent is, like, what is your opponent trying to react to, and what's the thing that's going to actually push them to be like, oh, that's a dash attack. They're about to do a dash attack here. Oh, they're about to do an aerial here, right? And those are the things that are effective. If you just think it's one size fits all, then yeah, you're just going to get clowned on, and that's not going to work, right? So being able to pull from that information is going to help you in terms of bettering your offense and also better understanding, but that comes from the better understanding of your opponent and what they're looking for. Like, you need to be able to tune in and sync it with your opponent to understand what they're looking for, right? So you can also tailor your general plan. Of course, you should have try to make as airtight of a plan as possible, right? But then now when you understand things, you can kind of be able to move towards that nuance, right? That's there.
Yeah. So high and top level review oftentimes is more about like optimization. Like Charles said, like you're finding like new solutions. The thing is though, like most of the time these players have a good idea of what the character can do. And so it's less about like, oh, you should have a game plan, because most of the time there's already a game plan in effect. Well, I say most of the time, but you'd be surprised. Anyway, I think to me, there are two elements to Vod Review when you want to succeed at a top level. And so the way Tony describes it, I think he thinks about them more as like a united thing. I see them as a little bit separate. I think part of it is like, okay, how do I improve my game plan? How do I improve my decision making? How do I improve essentially the one player game? And so it's like the decisions that you make regardless of the matchup, regardless of the person, kind of like your bias essentially. And then there's, on the other hand, there's like the decisions you make in response to the opponent. And so they are intertwined, obviously. The reason I like making that distinction is because I think, so to me generally, and I'm sure you guys have heard before, but like fighting games are turn-based games, right? And so I think generally when it's your turn, in other words, when you have an advantage, and it doesn't have to be advantage state, right? It can be like a minor advantage state. Like, for example, I'm playing Cloud against Mario, and I have Cloud in the mid-range. I have an advantage in his range. That means that I'm going to play around what I want. And so that is kind of like the focus on your own actions, because generally what you want is pretty universal from matchup to matchup. There's going to be exceptions, but generally, Cloud wants to short hop Becker. You know what I mean? Shoal keeps you at sword distance. Mario wants to get up close. And so these things are pretty universal. And so you'll find more patterns in these styles of gameplay, and they're also easier to practice because they are so universal. Then on the other hand, there's like understanding the opponent and how do you respond to the information that the opponent is giving you. And so, talking about the former, right? So how do I work on like my own decision making? I think more than anything, the most important well, the perspective that I use is that at the end of the day, improvement is making better decisions. It's the exact same thing. And so what we're trying to do in VOD review is we're trying to look at where your decisions are weakest. And so there are essentially two things that go into your decision making. One is the amount of variables that you consider when you make a decision, and two is how do you value the variables that go into the decision. And so, for example, Leo was destroying everyone by basically valuing spacing and stage control really highly when other people did not. And so these are generally like elements of the game that should be valued highly because the payoff, the expected value, again, kind of going back to those 5 aspects, the valuation, the expected value of spacing and stage control is relatively high. And so just on like an engine level, these are two very important things that you want to value in your decisions. And so there are more things like this where I feel like, okay, these are things that you should be valuing because they have a high expected value. And so when I review for people, I am always looking for situations in which they do something that I think does not align with high valuation. And the thing, again, about like especially top level players, they probably already take in a lot of variables, right? And so what you're focusing on more is the small errors in the valuation of the individual variables. So it's like, oh, in this situation, we were valuing the reward of a rising aerial. Maybe we should value the stage control and the long term a little bit more, or vice versa. Hey, here we should have noticed that he had this pattern because we are focusing our information gathering on it, but we're not actually getting to that payoff. And so figuring out essentially more variables to take into account is the hard part. But it's also very rewarding. So a new variable in your decision making tree, or generally that you take into account when making decisions, it can improve your overall results by a lot. But adjusting the specifics in how you value the individual variables is a lot more work because it's a lot less exact, and it also is a lot lower payoff. And this is generally what diminishing returns in Smash improvement come down to, is that eventually there's almost no more variables to take into account, really. And so you really start tweaking. And that's a lot of top level play. And so a lot of that is discussion, right? And I think we've all said this before. And I know Charles has a lot of experience, of course, working with Void and Tweak. A lot of top level review is discussion where it's like, I think this, what do you think? And then you talk about it and you see, hey, why do you value this the way that you value it? Why do I value it the way that I value it? And then you either come to a conclusion or you agree to disagree, depending on the player, of course. And so I think even if you're at like, as soon as you're at like a higher level, you already, like, I generally feel like if you have a solid game plan, you're at least mid-level, right? So once you reach like that high level, top level, that's where you should really start having most of these variables in your decision making already. And it's all about like that proper valuation. And so a lot of review comes down to that, like just thinking about an interaction, saying, hey, what are the other options? What kind of what Tony said regarding anti, right? You pause, you get surprised. So the way Tony says it is you pause and you make a prediction and then you see if it comes true. I take a little bit more of a generic approach. I just say, whenever I get surprised, I take note. And so if anything happens that's to me surprising, I'm like, okay, let's keep that in mind and let's see if there's like some sort of pattern that I recognize. And again, when I recognize pattern, I use the same system, interaction, situation, strategy. And so there's always these individual interaction, which again, at top level, you're not going to find too many patterns in, but there's a little bit more pattern in the context, right? You'll see the same context over and over, like Cloud, again, doing short hop Becker. Okay, there's a specific context in which this works. And then there's your overall strategy, which I feel like the better you get, the more mileage you're going to get out of refining strategy, especially. And so that's my general approach for like higher and top level review. I think there's a lot of mileage in, there's a lot of merit in looking at both like what I do when I'm strong and what do I do when the opponent's strong, right? As like separate things. And I think there's a lot of merit in looking at them as like a unified thing. I think the more nitty gritty you get, the more you're just not combining, but the more you're rewatching the same VOD with a different perspective. And so like for me personally, there's usually about like 5 to 10 rewatches for like really top level VODs before I feel like I have a good understanding of the dynamics going on. And every rewatch is with a different like perspective and focus. And so my starting point usually is, okay, what do I do when I'm strong? What do they do when they're strong? And then from there I go into like the other perspectives that I think are all valuable in their own way.
So for those who don't have a game plan, something I personally like to do to find that, which you can do through specifically winning VODs, I think is a little bit more valued because
Agree.
you know every winning VOD is going to have at least 3 stocks taken. And so, well, unless it's a timeout victory, which is also applicable here. So the idea is you want to look for the end of the VOD and then work your way back. So basically just go ahead and rewind it in chunks and kind of transcript the match. And I recommend transcripting the match in general. If you have difficulty following VODs, this is something that I hear happens for people watching their own VODs in particular, is that people will say, I can watch other people's VODs and study it, but I can't watch my own. And so the simplest thing I do is to try and externalize it a little bit further from yourself by just writing it down like you're trying to narrate it. So essentially you're writing a script for how you would commentate the match as dryly as possible. And so you want to go ahead and write down all the details that pop out at you. You write it down on paper, and then once you're actually looking down at things on paper, it's simpler to notice patterns. But I'm digressing a bit here. So the idea is you go to winning VODs, whether it's you or other people who are playing the character that you're playing. You look at the different ways that they took the stock or reached a timeout, and then walk it back. What positions did they do to get this finisher? How did it get the opponent into KO percent or into the KO setup? Did they have to bait them into it, or was there a specific habit that existed there that you can see patterned over? How did the winning player pick up on that pattern? Like, when did you see them first notice it? And how could you have noticed it if you looked for that same thing? Like, is there a pattern there? And you're looking for these things. And so, especially since you are watching the VOD in reverse, there might be a pattern or habit there that you are seeing cashed in on from the winning player noticing it. And as for identifying where that habit came from, you are going to essentially start looking for it after you already know it exists, and then you're looking for essentially the formative parts of that or components of that pattern. So you're noticing it essentially before the pattern even exists because the winning player is calling out on it. And this is particularly valuable for beginning players who are wanting to learn their characters initially. Any conscientious player who's wanting to watch or pick up a new character is going to generally watch the top users of that character winning with that character, and then try and essentially the idea is you want to replicate their successes by working them there backwards. And so once you figure out how they get to the wins, eventually you will start to pick up on patterns. Like, these are the most winning tools that I'm going to have, or these are the stocks that I'm most likely to close out with these gameplay patterns. How can I create these gameplay patterns more often? And so then the idea is essentially there's different ways you can go about this. I think the most common way is to just go ahead and write a flowchart in which you have these gameplay patterns supported as close to the beginning of your flowchart as possible. And so the idea is you essentially want to set yourself up to win the game as simply as possible, because the simpler your game plan is, like the smaller your flowchart is, the more reliable it is going to be, because it's just common wisdom. The more complex your plans are, the more likely they are to fail. Therefore, you can just look at that in reverse and say the simpler they are, the more likely they are to succeed. So keep your plan simple, keep it effective, and begin from the inning, and then try and bring that back to go, as we mentioned before.
Raw of Nair, baby.
Yes, sir.
And effective.
Yeah,
It's like the interaction situation strategy thing, right? You just check out where you want to end up first, and you try to see how can I get there.
Yeah, one thing I want. Go ahead.
I was just going to say one thing to close it out. This is another one of those things that transcend Smash. If you begin with the end in mind on any task that you're pursuing in life, and you work your way back to how am I going to get there from where I'm at now, you're a lot more likely to succeed. What were you going to say, Ben?
I was just going to add into, because I know you were talking about patterns, right? And so that's going to be a big one, how you can identify patterns, how quickly you're identifying them. And also, another big thing, especially when you're going to like high to top level, is when you can cash out on those things, right? Because that varies greatly when you're looking at kind of lower level or slightly getting to mid level, right? A lot of times, if you're low and mid level, you can hold on to that stuff, right? And then it's like the big moment, boom, wash your hands, you didn't see that one coming in, and you go on, right? And you're good. Yep. I knew you were gonna do this, right? But when you're dealing with someone who's a higher level, right? They're also watching their play. They're also understanding, okay, this is I've done this a couple times now. This may be a habit, right? They may be doing this intentionally, right, to bring you out. And so when you have the big pressure situation and you're like, oh yeah, I've seen him doing Cineroar side B this whole time, I'm gonna get it, right? And then all of a sudden, you get clapped up, right? And then they pop off and they win. And those things are really, really important and high to top level, because people are going to be adapting faster. The sheer, it doesn't take these guys, it doesn't have to take them a set to adapt. Sometimes it doesn't have to take a game for them to adapt, right? It could be like, I played this stock this way. Oh man, what the hell was I doing there? And they're already changing it up. And next thing you know, there's a wave of, strength in his body, right? We've seen Cola do this so many times. When he's there, it's like, oh man, Cola, he's on this last stock already. Is he just going to lose to this random person? And then there's just a wave of power, and all of a sudden people get, jammed, get hit by a nice little jab back air, get hit with a freaking tech chase forward smash and black excellence, and all of a sudden he won. Good job, Cola, right? But it's like on a serious note, that really comes down to the level of the level of adaptation that you're going to see from these players. So you have to recognize what cards you're being dealt, right? When you got to play, and you also quickly need to recognize, when can I actually cash out here? Or is this a setup for something long-term, whatever it may be? Because that's going to be a lot more nuanced, as opposed to, these lower level players. So I think that's a big one as well.
Yeah, and another general tip that I had, I think this applies for all levels of play. If it feels a little overwhelming to VOD review, simplifying things to defensive and offensive options is another great thing, especially when VOD reviewing your advantage state. Because realistically, your advantage state should only kind of revolve around, there is a third option that not all characters have, is like some kind of mobility option, monkey flip, Sonic up B, stuff like that, right? Some of them have a hitbox, some of them don't. But there's generally offensive, defensive, and mobility option, right? And when it comes down to you covering a defensive option, it usually involves you not being in shield and trying to chase down said defensive option, whether it's a neutral air dodge, whether it's directional air dodge, right? You're kind of in this somewhat of a stance where you think you're trying to react not to an air dodge specifically, but some kind of defensive option, right? And then if they do a mobility option, as long as you're out of the way, you can freely move because you're trying to cover a defensive option. If you're trying to cover a offensive option, you're more so trying to get out of the way of the hitbox and whiff punish it. Some of these hitboxes are harder to whiff punish than others. Your character might have not the tools to whiff punish it, so you're going to try to run up and shield said hitbox and maybe try to punish out a shield if your character has that, or that. So that's just another general thing that you can use to simplify the VOD review. And I've also simplified using this technique with top level players to simplify the VOD review. And it's really interesting to hear, especially Tony and Ramses's viewpoint on VOD review, because I can relate it to when I VOD review with someone like Light, where Fox doesn't have a really complex set of tools. They're pretty simple, and the character just has very simple and effective tools in many different situations, right? So I can relate a lot to that, but most of my experience in coaching was towards the beginning of the game. And that's why for me, a lot of my experience was problem solving. And also I think it kind of relates to that because the two main players that I coached were Void and Tweak, and I think they're some of, if not the most innovative players in Smash Brothers history. So the array of tools I'm working with is very wide. So it's like, oh, hey, I have this new tech. How can we apply it to this matchup? I'm also very talented and have played this game a lot. I'll have it ready by next week. So it's like, with most other players, it's not the case. And usually you want to have a more simplified tool set to make it more streamlined, right? So again, I compare it to Light, where it's just Fox is a lot more simple of a character and doesn't have a lot of tech, as to where, you know, Diddy or any other character Void plays, usually he wants to be on the more technical side and he wants to apply this very wide toolbox. And another player that I actually really enjoyed that falls more towards the innovative side was Peanut. He got a good amount of lessons with me when I was coaching on Metafy, and it was really fun for me to coach Peanut. And the big one we went over were tough matchups, right? So I love coaching a character or a player that uses a lot of tech, and also it's a bad matchup. So it's like, how can we use this tech to essentially overcome this bad matchup? Because in these scenarios, you don't have a lot of options. So how do we, how do I bring to light more options, or how do I bring to light the other options that we might not have explored to give you more options in these scenarios that make the matchup bad, right? And I mean, for example, one thing was like finding time to set up Saw Blade. Is it worth to advantage state, or is it worth to set up Saw Blade for the next neutral interaction against Roy so your out of shield is stronger and faster, right? So that's like a small example of one of the many things we went over with me and Peanut, and obviously Tweak with all the different Diddy scenarios. So it really comes down to also what type of player you are, because do you want to widen your toolbox? And even if you are more of a technical player, also being realistic of to when this option will be available in tournament. Some tech is very hard to grind. You know, for example, Tweak was recently on like a banjo thing, and he never brought up the banjo in tournament, but like, is he going to use the banjo tech where you go ahead and cancel the neutral B into the side B? It's very hard. It's like a 1 or 2 frame window, and he even said it's one of the hardest techs he's ever done in Smash ever in his life. So something like that would take probably, you know, 2 or 3 months for even someone like Tweak to get have ready in tournament. So also knowing how long it's going to take for your tech, even something simple like a footstool out of shield. When are you going to be ready to do a footstool out of shield in tournament and feel comfortable doing it? You might want to start off with just footstooling out of shield and repositioning. Maybe you play Joker, so if you footstool someone, you still have down gun, so it's not that bad of a disadvantage state for you, right? Where you're like in the air and stuff like that. So even going through the motions of getting your tech ready to apply to tournament and being realistic with that, I think is a very big deal. I remember one of the first VOD reviews I did with Tweak before I even joined TSM was going through all of his Evo VODs. And one thing that we talked about, which wasn't even being done, was how we said that Wario Bike, putting it down on the ground, is going to be the future of the character. Guess what Gluto does in Overhead?
Here we are. Yep.
Yes. And we knew that already, but that is something that we discussed, and we talked about the pros and cons, right? Again, like Ramses was saying, just discussion is key, especially towards the beginning. I feel like now VOD review, a lot of my experience from VOD review is not as applicable to today's day and age, because the game is way more on the solved side. Like, we're not going to, like, Fox isn't going to get some innovative new option that we're going to rave about and be like, oh, okay, this, and this. So since I did a lot of my coaching experience was more towards the beginning, I think one thing that I have a huge strength in is matchup specific VOD review, where especially with it, if it's a character that has like an item or more niche options that kind of give you this toolbox, like maybe even like Peach or something like that, where you have this huge wide array of options, but you're trying to pick out the specific ones that will give you more options in a bad matchup specifically, right? And I think even going into VOD reviewing for bad matchups, that's kind of how I want to close this off, is your guys' opinions on VOD reviewing for bad matchups, because I mean, that's something that I feel like most players will come to us for advice on, right? So Bam, what are your thoughts on VOD reviewing for bad matchups? What are like the pinpoint you want to get to?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, again, going back to kind of like game sets, right? Seeing like what particular is going to be like the main problem here, right? With this character. I think sometimes when you're looking at, when you have a bunch of people, right? And they're like, okay, this matchup is bad. Why? Well, it's like 2-3 things, right? Let's really break down. Let's get into the nitty gritty of what exactly is making this like hardship, right? And you will find a lot of times, and this especially for kind of like mid to high level, like I feel like you'll get a situation where people feel something is bad because it's changing how they do their general game plan, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad matchup per se. And so I think really being able to identify exactly what that is goes a long way, right? Like, oh, well, they're able to catch monkey flip here, or they're able to catch when they have a banana here. Now it's like it's hard for me to be mobile here in terms of my traditional options, right? And it's kind of to what your point is, like, okay, how can we, let's look at all the additional options that we have, and let's see, now that you are absent of these preliminary options that you usually see as like these strengths and you 100% need that, let's see if these other options aren't as bad as you think they are. Because there's a lot of times when you kind of come back and you revisit things, once something's taken away and you're really looking at how to utilize it, you're like, oh, you know what? I actually did have this option here. I never realized how strong it was because I've been so accustomed to playing a particular way with these general set of tools, and these were my breadwinners, so I didn't even look at anything in the attic, right? I didn't look at anything in the closet. Now that I'm looking at these tools, okay, wait, I can actually work with these.
It's like plan A versus
always
plan A. Sorry for
but
like
most plan A versus plan B. Yeah.
It's usually just like this character's plan A, this character's plan A. Clash. Okay, who wins? And most of the time, the general community would be like, "That's a bad matchup for this character because Fox plan A is a vertical gameplay, and then against Game & Watch." That doesn't work, right? So Fox can still win that matchup and it's still winnable. I still obviously it's probably still in favor of Game & Watch, but usually a general output or outlook on a matchup is like, what does this character usually like to do? What does this character usually like to do? And usually the character that loses the matchup, you have to dig into your plan B or C in a sense of like, what are the other unique tools that I don't really use that much because they're not as strong as the other tools, but my strong tools get beat out. So I kind of have to dig a little deeper in the toolbox and maybe use some of my more niche options, right?
Yep, 1000%. And the thing about it is sometimes you find, right, it's like, okay, my tactic here is how am I going to mitigate this character's plan A that seems to be so dominant against my plan A, right? And then how can I bolster my plan B, plan C? And sometimes you find situations where it's like, okay, now that I'm actually looking at these things in this way, oh, like, again, it may not be necessarily so bad now that I've really actually honed these tools. Because, of course, when you have something that's your plan A and it's really strong, you're probably going to hone that first, right? And you're going to master that first. And when you can go back and actually look at these other things and master them, some new options may arise, right? And you may get some more tells on how to operate in the matchup. So I feel like those are big things. Also, when we talk about circumventing a opponent's plan A, right? Looking at things like precursors, like we were talking about earlier. Like what do they do to get in a position so they can, operate and utilize this plan A, right, to beat you out, right? Like what position is this Game & Watch getting into so they can do the things that they want to do to you? And if you can understand that, right, and especially obviously when you get to the top level, you really need to look at that player specifically. But even like at the mid to high level, you'll see a lot of times like there's a nuance there, like there's a certain standard approach they have to get into that position, right? And like those things I love, like character habits, right? Like I love to talk about like character main habits as well, right? Like for example, more likely than not, if a Meta Knight's in a defensive position, they're probably more likely to jump because they have multiple jumps. Like that's a very standard basic one that a lot of people will know versus opposed to like if you're not that type of character, right? You're going to look, maybe you're looking for a roll or dash back, whatever it may be, because you have the speed, right? You don't want to be caught airborne because you get off stage, you get gimped or whatever, right? But understanding those like bits and pieces of how people get there, right? Going back to what we're talking about in the beginning of this episode, I think it's key to circumvent that plan A if that plan A is so strong. Because sometimes you got to be like, okay, my job here is not to clash my plan A versus their plan A. My job is to stop you from getting into the position so you can do your plan A. Also understanding how can I make your plan A less rewarding than it usually is? And then how can I use tools that can still operate in spite of your plan A, right? And I think that's how you should be tackling a lot of these hard matchups.
Yeah, and so I just kind of wanted to hook into something that Charles was talking about because I think is a good example of what I was discussing earlier, and then I'll get back to bad decisions. Charles was talking about like implementing like new tech into your gameplay. I think it's a very, very interesting thing, because when do you like go for a metal blade trick, or when do you go for like your standard like Becker, right? And so I think something that's important in your flowcharting, in your game plan, is that you don't just have like the game states and how they flow into each other, but you also have the proper questions in place. And so that's a big thing that you want to do during review, is you want to ask yourself, hey, am I asking myself the right questions? And so, for example, when we're thinking about, okay, metal blade versus like just a back air, and I know this is like a weird example, but it doesn't really matter what options I'm using. We should ask ourselves, what context makes it so that metal blade is better? What context makes it so that Becker is better? And so your job is to identify the right context and then also be aware of it during a game. And so that's something that I think is very important when you're like implementing new things into your play, is that you're always thinking, okay, what do I think is the right context for this? And what do the results say? And so a lot of flowchart, like a lot of where flowchart goes wrong at higher levels, is not necessarily like the flowchart itself. The structure makes sense. It's just that the lines between them don't have the right questions attached to them. And so it's like, oh, I'll do this because there are kill percents. Whereas in reality, you should do it because you read a specific option, right? So like those type of differences are actually really, really important. And so talking about bad matchups, very, very related. I personally categorize two types of bad matchups. I think there are bad matchups where the opponent negates a lot of your strengths. And I think there are bad matchups where the opponent's strengths coincide with your weaknesses. And so to take Shulk as an example, I think Shulk has a really good mid-range. Doesn't really matter against a character like Mithra. And so Mithra negates a strength that I have. Compare that to, for example, Sheik. I can play mid-range against Sheik. The issue there is that her frame data is really fast and my frame data is really slow. And so it's not that she's negating my mid-range, it's that she is hooking in on a weakness that I have. And so you want to play these matchups very differently. In the matchups where you have your strengths, you play a lot more standard. And you still have access to like your strong tools. You just got to play around their strong tools a little bit more. Whereas if your strengths get negated altogether, you usually have to resort to entirely different game plans. And so a lot of the time, what it kind of comes down to is that bad matchups are not very different from normal matchups. And what I mean by that is that a bad matchup essentially means that there are more situations or more common situations or more extreme situations in which you are weaker than the opponent. And that's going to happen in every matchup. And that's also why sometimes people say, hey, you should play your bad matchups with your main. It's going to make you better. It's going to make you a better player. And it's something that I agree with entirely, because again, these situations, they might not be as extreme, but the core way that you're approaching these situations is the same. You are weaker than the opponent, either because you don't have a strength or because your weakness gets abused, and you should be playing around that. And so generally, I think the first step in bad matchups is the same as in normal matchups, is to check them. You want to check them. Can they execute well enough to actually abuse this advantage that they have? You want to check, do they have the knowledge? Do they know that this is an advantage that they have? Are they piloting correctly? Like, are they in the moment? Do they value their options correctly? Like, these are all checks that you can force upon your opponents. And so, for example, there was a tweet a while back of Spargo versus Light, and it was crazy. It was the ending of a game, and Spargo just Beckered Light, and Light just A-landed and dash up smash Spargo. And like, on paper, that situation is awful for Fox, because you're in the corner, you're just getting out of a juggle. You really don't have a lot of options, whereas Cloud has like a landing Becker. He's going to cover like 90% of what you're going to do. But Light, instead of saying, oh, I'm weaker, I'm going to play defensively, he checked Spargo and he was correct. And so if at that level, two of the fastest players in the world, who also have some of the most consistent execution in the world, if they can check each other, you can do it too. And so the first step is to always see, okay, is my opponent actually ready for the strength that they have? Are they actually playing around it? Now, what I generally recommend in bad matchups outside of that is, and this is mostly these are mostly bad matchups in which you don't have access to your strengths. What I would say is think about the opponent's weaknesses. So again, we're thinking about interaction, situation, strategy, right? And so your good interactions are half your strengths and half their weaknesses. And so sometimes you can create a matchup that is fine even though it doesn't feel fine in the first place. So again, I'll use Shoke as an example, Shoke versus Snake. I know a lot of people think Shoke versus Snake is awful, and I see why, because all of Shoke's normal situations kind of suck ass for him. But if you think about Snake's weaknesses, suddenly Shoke's flexibility allows him to frequently set up situations in which he's not strong, but Snake is even weaker. And so, whereas in his strong situations, so his usual strong situations, Shoke is like an 8 out of 10, Snake is a 10 out of 10. Instead, what we're doing is we're bringing Snake down to a 5 out of 10, and we might only be a 6 out of 10, but that's still stronger, right? And so a big part of bad matchups is to kind of like pull your opponent down instead of trying to force yourself to be stronger than them in the situations in which you're used to. And so that's my general advice, is to think about their weaknesses as well, and to kind of base your strategy around them. That doesn't mean that you're reactive, by the way. Just to be sure we're on the same page. You don't have to be reactive. You don't react to them per se. You can take the initiative to put yourself in a situation, in a context in which they are confronted with their weakness in some sort of way. And so that's what I do recommend. I agree with Tony. I am in the field of proactive is good. The issue is proactive and reactive is a very hard distinction to make, because what makes you decide to be proactive? Well, it's the reaction to the situation beforehand, right? So you're in constant like flux of like reacting to the current situation, deciding a proactive course, and then reacting while you're proactively creating situations. And so I'm not the biggest fan of that distinction at all levels, but I think especially if you're starting out with Vod Review, it is a very good distinction to make, because it's going to simplify the game in a way that allows you to at least inform your decision making for probably the next couple of years of your Smash career. Let's be real. And so playing around the opponent's weaknesses doesn't mean that you're reacting to them. It means that you're proactively playing around win conditions, around good situations, in other words, that aren't necessarily related to your strengths, but they're related to their weaknesses. And generally, these weaknesses are also kind of generic. And I don't mean like generic as in it applies to everyone, but like, let's say, oh, Snake is slow at moving around. Well, Snake's not the only character in the game that's slow at moving around, right? So if you're going to base your win condition around his speed, you can apply that to a lot of different matchups too, even winning ones or even ones. And so that's, again, why I really recommend that you play out your losing matchups with your main. It's good to have a secondary. I'm a secondary enjoyer. Like, if you want to succeed at the highest level, for sure. But in terms of your overall growth, it has a lot of benefits. Tony, why don't you close this out?
Well, first I'll say there's a lot of different dimensions you can take here. Again, reiterating the creative thinking W's, you can use each one to recontextualize or look at a different dimension of the game. So rather than asking, well, since Peanut was mentioned, we'll use Mega Man, Peanut beating Shuton at Cirque 3. So rather than saying, well, what Mega Man does is he plays this projectile game, plays with pellets, kind of feels out his opponent, and then sets up for information so that he can then win based on how the opponent responds to this. That doesn't work very well against Olimar, because Olimar basically does the same thing, but if they both try and play the same game, then generally Olimar's projectiles either ignore or just generally out-tempo Mega Man's if they're both putting them out. And so the idea that is, well, what if it's less about playing Mega Man to Mega Man's strengths and less about, well, if we're playing the matchup from Olimar's perspective, what is Mega Man good at or difficult to deal with as Olimar? And so something that Mega Man does very effectively that most characters can't is he can deal with the dynamic of hit lag on Pikmin when you are trying to play the minigame of controlling Olimar's Pikmin lineup. Because the idea is this is actually a 2-player minigame that each player wants to play around Olimar based on how much he's extending his Pikmin hurt boxes. And then, of course, the opponent is then welcome to prune and essentially breed out whichever Pikmin he wants to have in Olimar's lineup. And if the opponent doesn't recognize this minigame, then generally what you see is Olimar eventually is going to end up with a purple lineup. But purples are also items that are essentially more vulnerable to being pruned. And so where you usually go here in a matchup dynamic is that when you attack these Pikmin, you're going to open yourself up to more commitment than usual because you are adding hit lag to your attack. And so you're basically hitting a shield that Olimar does not suffer hit lag from. And so Whiff Punishing is a lot more committal than normal, especially when you play a character with high hit lag values. However, because Mega Man has so many either disjoints that he can retreat with, or just straight up projectile attacks like up air, down air, etc., he can put out attacks that will either instant kill or do most of a Pikmin's health through down air, that then also does not really commit his hurt box or keep him into the hit lag because it is not applied to Mega Man, just the projectile. And so this, in conjunction with some fairly ambiguous things like Leaf Shield, are tools that essentially allow Mega Man to be a little trickier than normal and provide some difficult to answer positions or situations for Olimar. And so by recontextualizing it to being annoying for Olimar rather than being effective for Mega Man, you can be more likely to achieve your victory screen, just because you can make it less about playing well and more about making your opponent play poorly, as we mentioned before. Another way you can look at it is, could I have applied my game plan differently? Did I have to be in those spaces? Did I have to be at those places at those times? Could I have done it a little bit faster, a little bit slower, and gone for the same exact plays? And would it have changed the outcome? And all of this brings us down to what is ultimately what you want to be doing in a given VOD, which is you are not supposed to be looking at especially a tournament VOD, in isolation. It is supposed to be something that you have considered and put effort into prior. Whenever you are playing, you should have the proactive elements of your characters practiced beforehand. You should have your bread and butter combos, your niche and repeated technical inputs practiced so that you're going to input them. And then when you watch the match, you should be able to look at these technical inputs, and anytime you see a mistake, write it down. Whenever you see the same mistake again, make a notch next to it, write it down, have some tally marks going. And then when you're done looking at the VOD, look at your list of tally marks. You now have a list of things that you need to practice on your technical side of your character in front of you, and you have it prioritized by most commonly repeating. At the end of the day, there's two kinds of impact or impactful execution that you can have. There's the ones that are going to have unusually impactful on a unit per unit basis. So this is things like a Nair to up smash for Fox, or alternatively, you can have it on a more repeated basis, which is, okay, I as Mega Man am supposed to get footstool Metal Blade here, and I'm consistently not connecting my footstool into my Z-drop Metal Blade. This happened 5 times in this game. I need to work on that. And so one of these is more obvious because it's, oh, hey, I missed the kill. The game is completely different now. And then the other one is, oh, this just didn't happen. And so footstooling and missing that Z-drop still sets you up so that you're pretty safe and you're not going to be punished for it. But the idea is you are still recognizing that there is something that is coming up repeatedly. And so what would the game have looked like if you had gotten 5 footstool to Metal Blade Z-drops? And so then you go back, you take that information and you go into training mode. And you can do this and use this to study for glory players. And the idea is you focus less on what your opponent's doing, and you can still look for their tells, look for movement options that they picked before they attack, things like that nature. Look for their ledge option habits. Did they have a pattern of this? But the idea is, if you look at nothing else, you can always just go back, focus on your character, write it down in sequence. And anytime you see something, oh, that's not what I input, write down what you were supposed to input instead. Keep track of it. You practice it. You go in training mode. You practice it again. Once you're comfortable with it, you go back in For Glory, play another game, save the replay, back out, watch the VOD. Go back in training mode. Keep track of the technical misinputs that you made. Repeat. And following this process can allow you to have a very effective single-player game plan going forward. And as long as you're thinking about what could have worked better. And so if you say, well, what were all the possibilities here? So to go back to Ramses' example of things that surprised me, what could I have done to have anticipated this situation? And what is the optimal thing I can do to respond to this once I have anticipated? What is my commitment? And how can I get as much reward while committing as little as possible? And then focus on that, and you will have set yourself up an effective iteration loop that you can then follow. And from there, it's just a matter of function of time, and also, of course, how perceptive you are, how effective you are at this. But this is, as per usual, a skill set that you can practice and improve at. This is something that, as you put in the hours every day over time, after years of doing this, you'll become quite effective at which I promise you.
All right. Well, that's going to be it for this episode. I know this was a highly anticipated episode. I know a lot of people wanted to hear about Vod Review from all of our experiences within the community, and especially within, Ultimate's competitive lifespan. So I hope you guys did enjoy the episode. Again, if you guys do want to leave a comment, make sure and tell us what you think is the most important aspect of Vod Review. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And of course, also rate us on Spotify. And if you want to support us even more on Discord, you can go ahead and ask us questions on the Discord for $5 a month. And until next time, class dismissed.